Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Ohio EPA's first ever virtual compliance assistance conference. My name is Dan Sowery with the Division of Environmental and Financial Assistance here at Ohio EPA, and I'll be moderating this afternoon's NPDES presentation. Due to unforeseen circumstances, we've changed presenters. Walter Aris, Environmental Supervisor from our Division of Surface Water, will be our presenter this afternoon, along with Josh Griffin, also in the same division, to address regulatory questions during the presentation and during the Q&A period. With that said, I'd like to go over a few items to help you participate and engage with our presenters during this afternoon session. On this slide here, you will see a screenshot of an example of an attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on the right-hand side of your screen. For this webinar, you are listening in using your computer audio. If you are having sound issues, try refreshing your browser. If that doesn't work, log off and log back in, or check your computer's audio settings. Please feel free to submit questions to the presenter by typing them into the questions pane on your control panel. You may send your questions in at any time during the presentation. If we do not answer your question during the presentation or during the Q&A portion, we will reach out to you via email following today's webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording and a follow-up email along with the session survey. The session survey will also appear once this webinar ends. We value your feedback, and we greatly appreciate it if you let us know how we're doing and let us know if there's anything that we can do to further assist you. A certificate of attendance will also be included via email about a day or so after the session. This session has been approved for 1 hour of registered sanitarian and sanitarian in training credit, 1 contact hour of wastewater operator certification, 1 hour of VAP certified professional development credit, and 1 BMP hour towards annual education requirements for CNDD certified operators. If you did not submit your professional certification number in the CEU ID number box when registering, please make sure to provide us with your number through the Q&A feature. Please keep in mind, to receive credit for the wastewater operator certification, you must attend this full session, and the session must be the primary window open on your screen for more than 90% of the time. You must also participate in all live polls. Attendees seeking American Planning Association credit may do so through APA's self-reporting option. Log into your My APA account and select the self-reported credits option to receive credit. If you are seeking other CEUs, please refer to our conference agenda available as a handout to the presentation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Walter Aris from Ohio EPA's Division of Surface Water.
All right, thanks, Dan. Appreciate the introduction. So today, as Dan mentioned, unfortunately for those who had tuned in hoping to see Ashley Ward, our program manager, I'm filling in for her today. So what I wanted to go over today was some NPDES updates on our program, covering some of the upcoming rule and programmatic changes that we have on tap, as well as some of the other special program changes that may be coming. So just to go over an outline of a couple of the topics that we're going to be covering today, I'm going to go over some logistical and administrative updates. Then we're going to talk about some of the rules and regulations, like I mentioned, that we have on tap, going to be coming up here hopefully sometime in the next 12 months. And then I'm going to wrap up with a short discussion on 208 Water Quality Management Plan update that we're hoping to begin later this year. So some of our more administrative or logistical updates. In case of those of you may not be aware, all the Ohio EPA staff have been working from home pretty much since March 13th of this year. That's presented a couple unique challenges, but nothing that the agency hasn't been able to overcome. Actually, I was surprised at how quickly we were able to overcome them. So basically, we went from a standpoint where there were about 2 or 3 of our permit staff that had access to all of our network capabilities remotely before we went home, to about all 300 plus of us having access within about 3 weeks. So kudos to our IT staff who was able to get us all up and running in a teleworking environment. So as part of that, we've had to make some accommodations and have taken to holding virtual meetings and hearings. I don't know if any of you in the audience have had the opportunity to participate in some of those, but I've not personally, but some of my staff have, and they've indicated that they thought it went very well. So we've had several of these meetings for some anti-degradation hearings, as well as some public hearings in response to draft permit actions and things of that nature. So, as we continue to work from home, or teleworking, we will continue to have these type of platforms for our virtual meetings and hearings that are required as part of our public participation processes. One of the other things with the teleworking environment is that since we don't have staff in the office, we're no longer printing out, for instance, final permit documents, approvals, things of that nature, and sending them via, the Postal Service, certified mail or return receipt. Instead, we have adopted a procedure where we're getting PDFs of those final documents, and we've been emailing those to the affected parties and requesting return emails, basically just confirming receipt of the documents and, that they were able to retrieve them and they were all, able to be read and that type of stuff. So we will continue to use that approach, through this working from home type scenario. And the governor has indicated that all state staff are going to be working from home at least through January 4th. And that's a minimum. There is a potential that it could be longer than that or some type of hybrid coming back in. We really don't know how that's going to work yet. But so for the next few months, at least, you can expect to continue to see, electronic interactions from most agency staff. And, finally, one of the realities of working from home is that so we're no longer in the office to answer our telephones. Most agency staff do have the capability, though, of receiving our voicemail transcribed to our email. So in that process is pretty much real time. So if you are looking to get a hold of a particular agency staff member and you have our direct phone number, feel free to call that number and leave a voicemail. Most of our voicemail boxes should be empty or at least not full. So you should be able to do that. And then we would receive an email and be able to respond to you, most likely via email. So again, most agency staff do not have an agency issued cell phone or way to communicate with you directly. But we have been able to utilize the Microsoft Teams platform to call people basically, via a voice over IP type protocol. So while the phone number may not appear to be directly from the agency person that you called, it's kind of a default Teams number. It is the agency personnel. So moving on some of the administrative things, just from a personnel standpoint, just waiting here for the slide to catch up. Okay. So as I mentioned, Ashley Ward is our program manager. She was unable to be here today, so I'm filling in for her. I'm the supervisor. And just some other folks of note is I don't know, again, if anybody on the call is or on the line has had the pleasure of working with Eric Nygaard, a former longtime employee of Ohio EPA. He retired about a year and a half or 2 years ago. He has graciously agreed to come back on a part-time basis and assist us in some of these rule and programmatic changes that I'm going to discuss today, as well as some of our more technical projects that we have coming up. So if you guys do have questions or things like that on a industrial kind of side, Eric is available. There's his contact information is presented. And then I also wanted to introduce Josh Griffin, who's actually going to be helping me later in the presentation on the Q&A session. He is our industrial permit technical lead, and he is also our nutrient technical lead as well for all permitting issues related to nutrients. So our final kind of administrative topic that I just wanted to bring up for everybody's benefit was operator certification. So wastewater operators are required per our rules, as well as often as requirements of NPDES permits. The agency had implemented a rule change in 2017 that required reporting of the on-site staffing time for those certified operators to the agency. As part of that, we had begun a process of including the reporting of those hours via the EDMR system. The agency quickly realized that that was not the best way to obtain that information. So we've developed a new online application through our streams, through the e-business portal on our website that is specifically just for reporting those hours. And as part of that, so since we've been able to stand up that application, we will no longer be including the reporting codes and or outfall tables for the operator certification on-site staffing requirements within NPDES permits. And then for those of you, we did an agency-initiated action. It was about 1.5 years ago, I believe, at this point, where we included by default all those reporting codes into all effective NPDES permits that have operator certification requirements. The plan is to remove those requirements once the application has kind of been vetted for a few months and we've got most people using it. So that will be an upcoming change that you won't necessarily see it in your permit, but you will see it in the EDMR system when you go in to report your monthly analysis and results. So moving on from some of the administrative things, this is kind of a summary slide of some of the rules and regulations that I'm going to go over here today. I've kind of divided them up via kind of state initiated type things and kind of federal initiated type program changes that are needed. So, we're going to cover each of these just a little bit to bring everyone up to speed on some of the more recent goings on. Before that, though, we are going to have our first polling question. And again, there we go. So our first poll, does your facility have a individual NPDES permit, a general NPDES permit? Do you work at multiple facilities, or do you have no permit? So Dan, do you want to go ahead and...
Been launched. Once this shows up on your screen, if you could take a second and make your selection. Okay, most folks have made their selections. We're going to give it a few more seconds, and then we'll close the polls and share the results. All right, back to you, Walter.
So it looks like from the results, we've got quite a bit of our audience that works at multiple facilities. In a second, we got a lot of people with individual and general permits, and then actually about a third of our audience that does not have an NPDES permit. So to those folks, thank you for joining us. Hopefully you get something out of this today and learn something a little bit about our NPDES permit program. So continuing to move on about some of the topics that we had discussed. Again, just waiting for our thing to catch up here. There we go. So human health criteria. This is one of those programmatic changes that I mentioned that is kind of a state-initiated change to our program. The criteria as our rulemaking, and currently the status of that is that it's been handed over to JCAR for filing. So that's kind of the final step in a rulemaking process here at the state. As part of that, some of the changes that we're looking for here as part of that rulemaking is that there are some lower criteria proposed for some of the chlorinated organic chemicals. These are things like PCBs, dioxins, and hexachlorobenzene. So these are things that affect human health from the use of water, basically drinking water, so the consumption of our water through water treatment facilities. These permit changes, the pollutants here that we're talking about as part of these criteria changes mostly affect only those permits that are issued to organic chemical, plastics, or synthetic fiber manufacturers. That's where we see the majority of these types of pollutants show up. There are a couple other permits that do have these type of pollutants in them, but that's the major portion of the audience that's going to affect. So moving on from the human health criteria, some of the other rule changes that we're proposing to make are in regards to our general NPDES permit rules. These are located in Administrative Code 374538. Currently, we have completed the early stakeholder outreach portion of this rulemaking and are preparing basically draft rule language that then we can share with interested parties who have commented during that early stakeholder outreach. This is kind of like step 2 of a pared down version of our rulemaking process. Some of the major changes that we're making here, we're keeping the construct of the rule basically the same. Most of it's kind of administrative. We're updating some of the cross references that are included in this rule to portions of our other NPDES permit rule, which is located in Chapter 33, as well as some of the other minor changes. So it's kind of more of a housekeeping type item. And then one addition that we're proposing to make to the general permit rules is the creation of a procedure to modify your coverage under a general permit. We have facilities that, for instance, have general permit coverage and they obtained coverage, 2-3 years ago. They've had some changes at their facility that would still allow them to be eligible for the permit, but have materially kind of changed the condition of the facility from when they had initially submitted their notice of intent for coverage. And, we want to be able to provide our permittees a way to update that information to us so that really what they have is reflected out of their most current operations. So one of the more unique rule changes that we're going to be making here coming up is on something called our biocriteria narrative. This provision of a rule exists in our water quality standards chapter, so chapter 3745-1, in particular 07C. This rulemaking has gone through early stakeholder outreach, and we've had some really good public input during that session or that part of the rulemaking procedure. The agency has currently got some draft language put together that we've shared with actually US EPA and gotten some comments back from them. So we're reworking through their comments and hope to be able to proceed with interested party review in the very near future. So the main kind of provision of this rule is the idea that, and this is kind of quoted from the rule, is that biological criteria take precedence over chemical criteria. The federal US EPA has objected to this provision of our rule in the past for various reasons that I won't delve into here. But as part of that, Ohio EPA has a memorandum of agreement with US EPA on that. We will only entertain implementation of this provision of our rule only in the Ohio River Basin, not within the Lake Erie Basin. That has to do with some of the Great Lakes Initiative programmatic things that have come out of US EPA as why that memorandum of agreement was developed. So we're attempting to formalize that memorandum of agreement actually within the rule. So therefore, it puts it kind of helps end that federal objection is what we're hoping. So that's one of the big things that we're attempting to address with this rule change. We are also proposing to move some of the, there's some language here in the chapter 107 that references kind of NPDES implementation of how we put this rule into, or how we effectively incorporate this provision into NPDES permits. We're going to move that provision out of the actual standard portion of the rule and put it more into the implementations portion of the rule, which is in Chapter 2. So just kind of restructuring some of it. We are going to be keeping the takes precedence kind of concept here with the standard. So Ohio is in a unique position as opposed to most other states, in that we have a very robust biological program. And that allows us to actually have this provision in our rules. So we want to be able to include the ability for the agency to use this, but we're kind of narrowing the scope a little bit. So some of the more specific things that we are going to be adding to this provision is that specifically for the director to consider the use of this provision of the rule, because our current biocriteria scoring doesn't take into account, it takes into account aquatic life and so fish and bugs, basically. It doesn't really, though, address other aquatic species such as mussels and amphibians within the scoring that we have the matrix developed. So we are going to be kind of specifically pointing out that the director shall consider effects, or if we were to choose to implement this rule, the effects on potentially amphibians and or mussels due to this provisional use. We're also going to mention that downstream segments need to be taken into account. So really what we're talking about here is the use of downstream segments. Say we have a permittee that's discharging to a warm water habitat, and about a half mile or a mile or so downstream, that habitat changes to exceptional warm water habitat. That would be something that the director would take into account as part of their decision on whether or not to allow the implementation of this portion of our rule. It would also talk about things like narrative toxicity. So, are there toxic effects present in the stream? And these are all things that the current language in this provision of the rule doesn't include. So these are things that we're hoping to include in order to kind of more specifically narrow the scope of when it's appropriate to use this provision. And then finally, a part about biological surveys. So that basically we have a lot of, even though we have a robust monitoring program, there are several streams in the state that we don't have biological scoring for. So basically this requirement would include that, before the agency could consider this provision, that we would need to have biological survey work completed in order to back up basically its use. So moving on from the biocriteria narrative, another topic I wanted to talk about is water quality standard variances. So this is another provision of our rule that needs updated. There were some new federal rules that were promulgated back in, I believe it was 2015, that prior to that, there was no real federal guidelines on how states could implement variances to their standards. So what the federal EPA did was kind of set up a uniform structure for that, so that from state to state, all the programs were following the same guidelines. The US EPA is actually encouraging the use of variances through this program. What they would like the states to do is actually adopt the criteria, and they would rather see the states adopt the criteria and issue a variance rather than states not adopt the criteria because they have because there are issues with permittees being able to comply. So basically, they would rather have that baseline of the criteria within each of the state's programs and have people grant variances than the opposite. So, so some of the things. So you see the boxes here. So basically, the idea of a variance is that the stream, in order for stream standards to be met, there would be an interim condition, which basically would be the existing condition when the variance is issued. So, for instance, you have a standard, it's being lowered. The interim condition would be what the current effluent quality is. And then there's this idea of a highest attainable condition, which is, so after some controls have been put in place, what is the value that they can get down to? Can we get down to the standard, after a period of time? Or is it going to be something where we're never quite going to be able to get there? And how we get there is through the second box, which is called the process through a PMP, or a pollutant minimization plan. It uncovers things like source control for that particular pollutant, whether that be from industries or within the collection system. And it also includes things like process optimization at the wastewater treatment plant. So, are there processes that can be added or tweaks that can be made to improve the removal of the particular pollutant that we're trying to address through the variance? The major thing about the variance here is that it gives time. Time for either technology to catch up to help remove the pollutant that we're targeting, or time for funds to be raised in order to install technology that may not be available today, but may be available in the future. So some of the provisions in the variance rule is this idea of a multiple discharge variance, which there's probably a good portion of you on the call that are familiar with this. Mercury is our current, the only multi-discharge variance that we currently have in our rules. We are moving with the renewal of that variance as part of this rulemaking. We don't intend to make any major changes to the Mercury variance as it exists today. We found that we've had good reductions of Mercury through the MDV that we currently have, and we feel that it's been effective. We are proposing to actually include a second multi-discharge variance within this rulemaking, and that would be for ammonia, which I'll go into here in a little bit in a couple of slides, but just for everybody's benefit, the idea here for the ammonia variance is that it would only apply to small communities that have continuous discharge lagoons, and this variance would be based off of an economic and social impact. So we have like I said, I'll kind of go into that here in a couple of slides. So moving on we have our second poll question. So as soon as this slide pops up. Okay, so how many times has the Cuyahoga River caught fire? 7, 1, 13, or 26?
Okay, the poll has been launched. When this shows up on your screen, go ahead and make your selection. And once we have most people that have had a chance to vote, we will go ahead and close the polls and share the results. Okay, most folks have made their selections. We'll give it a few more seconds. We still have a few answers coming in. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. Walter, back to you.
All right, thanks, Dan. So the results here of that poll, so we can see it's kind of almost spread evenly as far as everybody's answers. The correct answer is actually 13. So that's the number of times that the main channel of the Cuyahoga River, kind of in that downtown Cleveland area, did catch fire. The good news is that, and this is just a little caveat for everybody's benefit, we did celebrate if you want to say celebrate, the 50th anniversary of the last time the river caught fire was last year in 2019. So the agency participated in a large 50-year anniversary of that. And this picture here before you is actually a picture of the Cuyahoga River within the Cuyahoga Valley National Park. For those of you who are interested, there's been some great webinars, YouTube videos, and things that have been put together on the restoration of the Cuyahoga River. So if you want to see a real success story of our program, we really have come a long way with what once was a very dirty and kind of gross river. So, okay, so moving on with the presentation. Next, I want to cover some of the other additional rulemakings that we had talked about initially. One of these things is use designations. So all of our streams and rivers throughout the state have designations that are associated with them as part of our rules. And from time to time, we update these based off of our aquatic life surveys and other chemistry surveys that we do every year. So some of these haven't been updated for quite a long time, some of them way back to like the early 2000s. So there's kind of a real need to get some of these things updated. We've kind of, because there are so many and it's been so long, we've divided them up into what we call 3 different waves. So wave 1 has been filed with JCAR as of August 25th, and it includes use designation changes in the basins kind of listed here. The kind of implications of these use designation changes is they sometimes affect how we apply our different criteria. So some of these changes include things that were once considered to be limited resource water or modified habitat that are now through various controls and or improvements in the watershed have now become warm water habitat, or we have situations where warm water habitat now meets the criteria for exceptional warm water habitat. So we're able then to, because of those changes, then the criteria that apply often get stricter. So that's the implications of changing these use designations. So that's the list there. And then this is kind of a map showing of where those watersheds exist in our state. So we are moving forward with that and are hoping to have those rules being able to be finalized here as soon as JCAR completes their review. Provided here, we've got a chart as soon as it catches up again. Okay, we have a chart listed here of some of the changes. So you can see that so the new additions are new stream segments within these basins that we've been able to survey and provide uses for that traditionally may not have had a use assigned to them. It was kind of a default use. So we have a default use in the state that unless it's included in the rule, the default is warm water habitat. We were able to actually confirm those designations and or come up with different ones that more accurately reflect the conditions within the receiving stream. And then within the Maumee and the Huron Basin, we did have some designation changes from what was currently listed. And then we also had several verifications where we were able to verify that, yes, the use that's currently in the rule is still appropriate. So those are kind of all listed there in that table with the numbers there on the final column to the right. So I mentioned that we have 3 separate waves of these use changes. So the wave 2 is the watersheds that are currently in front of you. It includes the Great Miami River Basin, the Scioto River Basin, and then 2 basins towards the bottom of the state that discharge directly to the Ohio River that are made up of really smaller kind of complexes of streams and creeks down that direction. We call them the Southwest Ohio River tributaries and the Southeast Ohio River tributaries. So there's kind of no major stream in that area, so we just lump them all together. So those designation changes are currently in early stakeholder outreach. So we've gotten those comments back, and we're working on a draft rule language, basically for those, which is pretty straightforward, and are hoping to propose that for interested party review here in the coming months. So moving on from the use designation changes that we've got coming up, I wanted to talk about some of our criteria changes. Primarily, one of the biggest ones that we have is selenium. So selenium is a pollutant that the federal EPA published a final criteria on in 2016. The state, Ohio, has yet to adopt this criteria. So this is one of the things that we want to do as part of this rulemaking package. Selenium is a pollutant that bioaccumulates in the environment, so it moves up through the food chain. And there's new studies that are available that were part of the federal rulemaking that show some of the reproductive and juvenile growth and mortality impairments that selenium can contribute to that were not included in the previous version of this federal criteria. So that's why Ohio is moving to adopt this criteria. We do have streams in our state that are impacted by selenium, where we see some of these effects that are kind of presented in this table here. So it kind of this table is kind of a hierarchy of how you get to a criteria and how you come up with that final value that's actually included in the rule. So we look at impacts to both fish as well as the water chemistry within the water column, and how those pollutants then act on both a fish tissue type standpoint as well as then the water chemistry. And ultimately, then we come up with a numeric criteria that is protective of both of those media. And this is similar approach to what is taken with most of our chemical specific criteria that exist in our rules. And then this slide here, this final slide on selenium, once it loads, give it a second, there we go, presents a table here of what the old criteria was and then what the new proposed criteria are. And again, these criteria are protective of some of these newer biological studies that have been done on the bioaccumulation of selenium. And as I said, we do have portions of our state that are affected by discharges of selenium. So we have been reaching out to them and working with them on what the effects of this rulemaking might be. And that's part of our rulemaking process. So moving on from selenium, I mentioned ammonia earlier, and so I wanted to take a little bit of time and discuss it here. So as I mentioned, US EPA developed a more stringent criteria for ammonia that they adopted in 2013. And this, in particular, this criteria, the newer criteria that they developed is protective of mussels. So the previous criteria did not really account for some of those mussel species. And this kind of goes back to some of those, as I mentioned earlier in our biocriteria narrative discussion, that mussels was traditionally been an organism that hasn't really been studied very much. And some of the newer federal rulemakings are beginning to include these species as they are very important to the health and quality of a lot of rivers and streams, particularly in Ohio. So this new criteria is protective of mussel species. It also includes some snail sensitivity species as well. So more of those filter feeders type organisms rather than the free floaters or the fish that actually live in the streams. So another pollutant that we're going to be covering as part of the triennial review is cadmium. And again, so the EPA had published new federal criteria for cadmium in 2016. The state is moving to adopt these criteria. The previous criteria for cadmium did not include, it was based off of kind of a limited data set of toxicity of varying species. The new criteria that was adopted in 2016 includes approximately 16 new species that weren't included in the original rulemaking. So it's a much more robust and sound criterion. And one of the new changes with the cadmium is that historically it has not been hardness-based within Ohio. So this rulemaking would actually, so it would take a static criteria and it would take into account the hardness of the individual receiving streams as part of our permit limit development. So that is one kind of significant change for cadmium that we do see. And then finally, these are the 5 pollutants here in front of you are kind of a list of some of the more minor changes that are also going to be part of this rulemaking. Copper, fluoride, strontium, barium, and peracetic acid. So for copper, the federal criteria has they adopted a model of the impact on biology called a biotic lignin model. And it includes the use of total organic carbon in coming up with the actual final number that you would use for the criteria. And unfortunately in Ohio, total organic carbon, has not been traditionally a pollutant that we included in our stream survey work or had our permittees, monitor for it as part of their downstream, in-stream monitoring as part of their permit. So we are currently proposing not to adopt the new federal criteria for copper. We're proposing to keep our existing criteria until we are able to get that total organic carbon kind of data that's necessary to include in that new model. Now, we do have a couple dischargers who are proposing to collect that data for us, and they have asked the agency to then calculate the new criteria based off of the data that they've supplied. But that's truly on a voluntary basis on a permit by permit type situation. Fluoride is kind of a very minor change. It doesn't really change the effective criteria that we use for NPDES permits, because most of the permit criteria are based off of an agricultural water use type is the most restrictive, and it will continue to be that way even with this proposed fluoride update. So that really, we don't expect to affect any of our permittees directly. Strontium is an update that is going to take into account, again, hardness, kind of like the cadmium that I mentioned earlier. So traditionally, strontium was not hardness-based. The new criteria will be hardness-based, as well as the same with barium. And again, barium was one of those parameters that we have new data for from some different species that weren't initially included in that criteria development. So that value will actually be going down a little bit. The criteria will be. So again, we've reached out to some of the permittees that we think this might affect, and are confident that we're going to be able to work through any compliance issues that they may have. And then finally, peracetic acid is a worthwhile mention. The state has adopted a criteria for peracetic acid. We do have a lot of POTWs that are beginning to use it as part of their disinfection for their wastewater treatment plants, as well as we are aware of several industries that use peracetic acid as part of their process. In particular, the food industry uses it for kind of washing vegetables and or fruits and things like that. So it is a new criteria. It is out there. And it is kind of not an emergency pollutant from an impact to the environment, but just an emerging pollutant from the standpoint of that the agency historically has not had criteria for it. So now we've kind of covered most of that, and we're moving on to this would be our third and final poll. So Ohio EPA, as I mentioned, is considering multi-discharger variances for which two parameters?
Okay, I have launched the polls. So when this pops up on your screen, please make your selections. We'll give everybody about a minute to go ahead and cast their selection. Okay, we have a little over half of the responses in. Let's give it a few more seconds before we close the poll. Okay, Walter, the majority of the folks have responded. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results for your comments.
All right, thanks, Dan. So the correct answer is ammonia and mercury. So as I mentioned earlier in our variance rulemaking section, we are proposing to keep the mercury variance that is currently included in our variance provisions, and we are hopeful to include a new multi-discharger variance for ammonia. And that would be specific to some of our smaller communities that used wastewater lagoons for treatment. So our last regulatory thing that I wanted to cover is a newer provision that was included in the revised code for all state agencies. And it required every state agency to go through all the rules that they have developed and basically complete an inventory of words that include shall, must, shall not, may not, and prohibit. So basically the legislator wanted a listing of from each agency of how many rules that they had that included these terms. And then the second part of that revised code lawmaking included that from basically of October of 19 until June of 2023, that anytime a agency wants to write a new rule that includes one of these words, they must remove two rules that include these words. So basically, we're calling it a 2-for-1 rule. So the agency, Ohio EPA, has developed the inventory that we met that requirement for December 31st of last year to provide that. And so that is a continuing provision that we have to meet with any new rulemakings basically until June of 2023, when that provision would expire, or if it's renewed by then we would continue to adhere to that. So just wanted to let folks be aware that that is something that the agency is complying with as we move forward with all these rulemakings that I discussed earlier. So switching gears from some of the rule updates and things like that, another topic that we felt worthwhile to mention to folks today is something called integrated planning. So integrated planning has to deal with mainly our wet weather impacted communities from a wastewater treatment plant standpoint. In particular, those communities that have combined sewer overflows. So it's a federal rulemaking that was adopted into the 40 CFR. And basically it allows for a community to incorporate all of their Clean Water Act requirements when we are talking about things like implementation schedules and schedules of compliance to construct things such as, wet weather provisions at their wastewater treatment plants and CSO long-term control plans. One of the unique things is that this rule actually was spearheaded by a number of communities here in Ohio, and they took that rulemaking, up to their U.S. congressman, and were able to get this, kind of spearheaded at a federal level. So that's a pretty neat thing. It does include, so it promotes aspects of green infrastructure as part of these plans. And so in order to make sure that the states begin to allow communities to incorporate the provisions of an integrated plan, the federal EPA has set up an office of an ombudsman to basically work directly on behalf of the communities with the state agencies to make sure that the states are providing the flexibilities as outlined in the federal rule. So one of the main provisions of the first things of this, of the federal provisions, was that each state needed to provide notice to all of their wet weather communities that the concept of integrated planning was available. So Ohio held a statewide workshop back in October of 2019, where we invited all of our wet weather communities that have combined sewer overflows or other wet weather issues, and had them all come together. And we went through what is the concept. We had several communities that spearheaded this effort at the federal level, actually provided presentations on what their involvement had been and what their experiences had been with both Ohio EPA and US EPA on this rulemaking. So what does it mean for Ohio? It means that for those communities facing wet weather issues, there are new flexibilities that were previously not allowed to be considered that we can include when we set compliance dates and schedules for, whether they be construction or implementation of things to address, wet weather overflows, stormwater requirements, as well as bypass provisions at their wastewater treatment plants. I also wanted to touch on, this probably affects possibly a limited number of our audience, but something worth mentioning. So steam electric effluent limitation guidelines are a federal kind of rulemaking. It sets up requirements for any steam electric power plant basically across the country that it has to comply with. The US EPA had proposed some revisions to these effluent guidelines in 2015. And then there was a proposed revision to those that were then issued in November of 2019. The EPA was able to finalize those revisions just recently on August 31st of this year. And it has to do with, so FGD is flue gas desulfurization wastewater. It changed some of the provisions in the rule in terms of that, and it modified some of the limits that had been included in that initial 2015 rulemaking. It updated those as part of this revision. It also addressed bottom ash transport water, and mainly one of the new provisions that were included in this revision was that it allows for a 10% kind of blow down from this waste stream during certain high flow periods that wasn't included in the initial rulemaking from 2015. And then there were no revisions to the fly ash transport water requirements of the rule. But one of the other major impacts of the revision was that it pushed out the compliance date for all of these provisions to 2025 or December of 2025. It was initially, I believe, sometime in 2023. So this most recent revision provided an additional 2 years for our steam electric power plants to comply with these provisions. One thing we're often asked about here at Ohio EPA, especially when we're giving NPDES presentations, is so are you guys going to put nutrient limits in our permits? We currently have no rulemakings that are currently proposed that would set some sort of technology-based or statewide level for phosphorus and or nitrogen outside of what is already included in our rules, which is basically a Lake Erie Basin 1 milligram per liter limit for all of our major dischargers. So the agency continues the approach of our TMDL program, where, so when we have impairments that are identified through a TMDL and those impairments are attributed to nutrients from point sources, that we include, load reductions as necessary from those point sources to meet the TMDL and bring the stream back into attainment. And I could give you a presentation just on nutrients, and so that's why I'm only touching on it briefly. And then finally, one of the things I had mentioned at the get-go was a 208 plan update. So a 208 plan is our statewide water quality management plan. It basically lays out a map of who is going to serve what area. So from a wastewater treatment plant standpoint, where is the city of Dayton going to serve for their wastewater treatment plants versus other areas of Montgomery County or other townships and things of that nature. So the last time the state had updated this plan was in 2006. It is overdue for an update, and we hope to we were hoping to begin work on it this spring, but unfortunately COVID has pushed that back. So one of the things about this update is that it's a very community-based and local-driven kind of document. And so there's a lot of public participation that goes along with it. And, we were unable this spring and summer to really kind of come up with a good plan to encourage that local input that we need as part of this update. So we are still hopeful that we can begin work on that here this fall. And so this update from the state standpoint would cover 64 counties. We have local area-wide management agencies such as NWACWA, and TMACOG in Toledo, MVRPC, things like that cover the other counties outside of the ones that Ohio EPA is in charge of. So because we have such a large number that we're in charge of, we are proposing a phased approach on kind of like a 2 or 3 county by year basis, where we'd start to begin updating, these areas of who's serving what is kind of the best way to describe this plan. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to touch on is, so we have, as part of our poll, it was, do you have an individual permit, a general permit, or multiple facilities? This is a list here of all of our current general permits that are available to permittees in the state of Ohio. So these are always options that are available to people as long as they meet the eligibility criteria. So, you know, if you have an individual permit and you feel that you may be eligible for a general, we encourage you to reach out to your local district office and your compliance person and kind of speak with them on, you know, if you might be able to move from an individual to a more general permit, if that's something that you might find advantageous. And then just finally, as part of this slide, we do have in here 2 potential new general permits that we've kind of are in the very early stages of evaluating if they would be useful and or beneficial to both the regulated community and the state. And these would be for sand and gravel quarries and or coal remining facilities. So you know, if you fall into either of those 2 categories and you're interested in things like that, you know, stay tuned. We are proposing to move potentially or investigate those things, hopefully sometime within the next year. So that covers all of the technical content I wanted to talk about today. So I appreciate everybody's attention. And I'll turn it back over to Dan.
Yeah, thank you, Walter. We're going to now begin answering questions submitted during today's presentation. And as a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in your attendee control panel. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. If we don't answer your question during the Q&A portion, we will reach out to you via email following today's webinar. As mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, we have Josh Griffin. So thank you, Josh, for coming onto the screen from our Division of Surface Water Q&A portion. We have a few minutes left before 3. And with that, Josh, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. So we got quite a few questions rolling in just as we kick this off. I flagged one earlier that I thought would be a good one for Walter to rehash for everyone. Someone just asked for him to kind of go through the 2-to-1 rule, maybe again. They were not quite sure how that worked. So, Walter?
Yeah. So, as I kind of mentioned, so it was a requirement that was added by the legislature that all state agencies had to create an inventory of all their rules that included the words, like I said, it was shall, must, and things of that. So basically, those strict requirements that somebody must do something. And then as part of any new rulemaking, what JCAR is then, so our Joint Commission on Agency Rule Review is doing is, so when we make that file with JCAR, if we're proposing a new regulatory requirement, we must remove 2 existing rule requirements. So basically, to put it shortly, they were unhappy with the amount of regulations that the state agencies had, and they wanted to see those reduced. So, and one of the interesting caveats in there is they specifically said that you cannot combine 2 existing rules into one to try to get around the intent of that requirement. So, I hope that kind of maybe clarifies that just a little bit. You know, we're still kind of seeing what the impact of that is because, like I said, it is relatively new. It just was handed down in July of last year. So, you know, we don't know what kind of impacts that will have on us. It is in place till 2023. So, you know, kind of still yet to be determined.
We also had thank you, Walter. We also had a question come through when you were talking about uses, about what uses would apply when a stream is not specifically listed in our Ohio Administrative Code in rule.
Yeah, so I believe our default is warm water habitat from an aquatic life use standpoint. All the other uses in the state, so they kind of all have a default use associated. So for recreation is one of the other uses. I believe the default there is primary contact recreation. I could be wrong. Don't quote me on that. And then from a water supply use standpoint, I believe the default uses are in both industrial water supply and agricultural water supply. There is a third water supply designation that is for drinking water use, but that only applies within 500 yards upstream, downstream of a designated surface water intake. So that's not a default. The default is kind of that agricultural industrial.
All right. I think it's 3 o'clock there. I think we may be following up with the rest of the questions via email if I didn't get to them during the allotted time today. I know there's a number that rolled in right at the end. I think Dan will go ahead and wrap us up.
Yeah, so yes, we will be following back up with everyone. Thank you, Walter, for filling in at the last minute and for your excellent presentation. Thank you, Josh, for assisting with the questions. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey. We value your feedback, and we greatly appreciate it if you let us know how we're doing and let us know if there's anything that we can do to further assist you. A certificate of attendance and a recording of this event will also be included via email about a day or so after the session. Join us tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. to hear from Ohio EPA's division chiefs as they discuss their program priorities and compliance tactics. And tomorrow afternoon at 2 p.m. for our panel discussion, highlighting successes, opportunities, and challenges of successful sustainability programs at 3 Ohio organizations. And if you have not already registered for these sessions or for other upcoming sessions, please check out our conference agenda attached as a handout to today's presentation. And with that, thank you for joining us this afternoon and have a great day.